I think I got everything turned on, put on YouTube. So all the videos up until today should be up. I got all those up this morning. In case there was anyone that was missing, remember you are having only a take-home test. Only a take-home test. And you'll get it this Wednesday, and it will be due, we say next Wednesday? So you like have a week or whatever to get it done. Okay. I know there's a couple of you that would like to come and see your test after class. That's great. I've got those. Those things have been entered. I told you guys last week that there weren't critical thinking and things for the integrated control of performance, which is a total lie on my part. Sin of omission. I apparently we had some, so I put those up. But you're not gonna have to do the critical thinking questions. We're not gonna have a quiz, but I just put that up so you guys would have something to kind of look at. Okay. All right.
Quick clarification question.
Yes, ma'am.
For the final, what are the topics for the final specifically? Is it resistance training?
And then this.
Okay, and that's it.
Yeah. It's resistance training and this. It's not a lot. It's not a lot. Although some of this is going to harken back to things that we've already covered. And so in that way, there will be some level of overlap. So the things that we're going to talk about today and Wednesday are, to me, I don't want to say this is the real exercise physiology, but this is the real exercise physiology. This is the thing that seems to excite most people and interest most people on a lot of levels. This is, I want to beat Skillet at a race. What should we test? How can we figure out who's going to win? And then how should we train to make those things happen? You want to race, Skillet? I'm woefully out of shape. So.
I'm dying right now, so.
You're dying right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you'll win.
Okay. So, and I probably don't know why I don't have the right title on all of this. So we're going to talk about a thing called critical power. But when I say that this is the integrative control of exercise performance, that's what I mean. This is the sum total of muscle function, nervous system control of those muscles, cardiovascular function, metabolic function, all wrapped together, all working together while you are running or cycling, kind of sprinting events and like one-off resistance training kind of competitions. That's a whole other ball of wax, okay? But for these other things, this is all of these things going together, which is why we do it at the end, even though it's probably the most fun thing, okay? So let me show you guys some of this. Okay, so these are some data that were published in 1925. This is the actual graph drawn by hand, okay? This is by the first exercise physiologist to ever win a Nobel Prize. The guy's name was A.V. Hill. He won a Nobel Prize for trying to quantify work done by skeletal muscle during contractions. And in some ways, we've all just been trying to kind of model the same thing ever since. This thing was published simultaneously in The Lancet and in Nature, which I guess in 1925 you could get away with publishing the same thing twice. But what you can see here, okay, this is, and it's on in some ways a logarithmic scale. This is the time occupied in a race in seconds. And then this is the average speed or velocity in yards per second, okay? Metric system hadn't really taken over yet. We're doing yards. And so what you can see then is this is what they tried to quantify as world record pace, okay, in yards per second. You can see here we have men walking, okay, men ice skating, 10 miles, 30 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles, 1 mile, 500 meters, men bicycling, men running. Here you see women running. I'm sorry, ladies, we didn't let y'all do hardly anything then, okay? And so it's the time that is occupied in that particular race and what's happening. And so what you can see the beginnings of here, okay? The beginnings of is this idea of what we would call this hyperbolic relationship between work output or pace and sort of the time that it takes to basically how fast you can do things. And what the general sense is that if I go faster, I don't go as long. Or if my race is shorter, I can go longer. And this seems to roughly be, this relationship seems to hold across walking, running, bicycling, skating. Okay. I can also tell you this sort of relationship holds in animals, it holds in birds, it holds in horses. Okay. This seems to be a naturally kind of conserved phenomenon of all animals because our skeletal muscles all work the same. Another thing from that, where it looks a little bit cleaner, this is sort of things that are a little bit shorter in time. This is world record paces. And what I want you guys to look is, this is this very clean hyperbolic relationship. We've got men swimming, running, women swimming, women running. Y'all didn't get to go very far because they were worried your uterus was going to fall out. I know I've made that joke before, but it's real. And so what you can note is that once we get out here into something, right, it doesn't matter how much longer we go, I'm not slowing down anymore, right? My pace that I can maintain, there is what we would call, statistically, there's an asymptote to all of this, where I go long enough and I don't ever have to slow down anymore. It kind of holds with all of this. This was the first observation of something that was identified and named in 1968 by guys that were called Monard and Sheridan. And it's called, this is critical swimming velocity or critical running velocity. We loosely refer to all of this stuff now as critical power because it's been most commonly studied for methodological reasons, ease on a bike. I gave you guys several papers about critical power. And so we call this the power duration or the velocity duration relationship. Okay? So we'll kind of start to try to elucidate some of the things that are going on. What I can tell you guys is that for most endurance events, this velocity, or if you're biking, this power, whatever this thing is going to plateau, that is the pace at which you can go, the work that you can do without fatigue. Without fatigue. You guys will see with some other data that if you go just a shade above these things, you're going to fatigue in a very predictable manner. If you stay below it or at this, you're fine. As long as we give you food and things of that nature, you can conceivably keep that up for a very, very long. Okay. The thing that is really important about critical power is that it allows us to predict exercise tolerance, or when you're going to have to slow down or when you're going to have to stop exercise. Okay. And we can model it mathematically and we can make predictions then. And so exercise that occurs at a work rate above this critical threshold can be modeled, and we can predict with a lot of ease when you are going to reach VO2 max and therefore reach task failure. If we put Sarah at 5 watts above her critical power, then we can estimate that it might take her 20 minutes to reach fatigue. If we put Brady at 50% above his critical power, he's going to go 30 seconds and he's going to fatigue. So there's this very predictable thing that we're going to talk about. This is, and this has not been that widely talked about until this recent. So I will tell you guys, I did not know that this thing existed until I came to OU. Okay, I was never taught this. Okay, we were taught that this idea of critical power basically occurred at lactate threshold. That's not true, as we'll see in the next few slides. Okay, and so I was taught this by one of our other faculty members, and it's some really cool stuff. Okay, so work above critical power can be described with this equation. Okay, T limit, this is the time that it takes you to reach task failure, is equal to something called W prime divided by your actual working power output and then subtracting critical power from all. So if you're working above critical power, okay, then this number is positive, and you divide that number into this thing that we call W prime, and then that tells us when you're going to fatigue. If you stay below critical power, this is negative, and in theory, you can go almost limitlessly. So this is what's called a two-parameter model. So I'll explain what W prime is here. Okay. This is an important parameter of people's aerobic metabolic function. We have historically talked about VO2 max, lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold, and things of that. This is another parameter that needs to be considered in the midst of all of these things. As you guys will see, you have two people that have the same VO2 max. If one person has a higher critical power, they should be able to win a race. Okay. So remember, just like lactate threshold, critical power or critical velocity is a metabolic rate. It's a work rate, okay? It's an amount of force that can be produced by the muscles where we can maintain a steady state of oxygen consumption and lactate production and a steady state of depletion of creatine phosphate, okay? It falls initially, and then we don't break down PCO. So this represents this limit, this upper limit of where aerobic metabolism can mostly meet the energy demand that is required for what we're doing. Okay. Some people have argued we should call this a critical VO2, which if you look at things, I'll show you guys a model put together by Mike Joyner, who we will talk about, who is weirdly enough an anesthesiologist at the Mayo Clinic, but also is like the world expert on endurance performance. And they do a lot of flow rate dilation. They study blood vessels and all those kinds of things. He's like probably the smartest man that I've ever actually encountered. And they lead all the trials for using the convalescent plasma for the COVID stuff in addition to all of that. He's a crazy guy. But he has a model of working things. Joyner and Coyle, and they call this critical VO2. It's all the same as with general, which we will. Right? Okay. So how we figure out what your critical power is, and how is that going to be related to this parameter that's called W prime? Right? The traditional way of doing this here is what we're going to call, this is a critical power curve. Okay. We've got time on the x-axis, and we have your power output on the bike or your running velocity. So normally what we would do in order to find this is we have a person do 3 to 5 or 6 bouts of exercise. Okay? So we're going to take Drew. Drew, do you like to run or cycle? What's your preference? Cycle. Cycle. We're going to take Drew. We're going to put Drew on the bike. We're going to figure out what his VO2 max is. We're going to figure out where his lactate threshold is in a pre-thing. Then we're going to have him come in, and we're going to do 4 bouts. But we're going to have him ride on the bike at a power output that is at various degrees way to a little bit over his lactate threshold. Okay? And we say, Drew, you're going to get this much wattage on the bike, ride as long as you can. And you just ride until you are like, I'm done, I can't go any further. And what we tend to see then when we do these 4 bouts is it's like, okay, he's at, let's just say his lactate threshold is 150 watts. We give him 175 watts and he goes, let's just say 10 minutes. Okay. We give him 200 watts and he goes 7 minutes. We give him 250 and he goes 2 minutes. We give him 300 watts and he goes 30 seconds or something. So you figure out how long it takes them to reach task failure at various power outputs or running velocities above this. You graph them all, fit this exponential curve to them, okay? And it looks something like this, right? That's how we've traditionally figured this out. And then the asymptote of all of this is your critical power. Now, what you guys see here with these boxes is going to mathematically represent something called W prime. W prime, the W stands for work, okay? What we think W prime is, and this is one of the craziest sort of things that I find to be just really fascinating in physiology. There's a finite amount of work. There's a finite amount of power output or velocity, whatever you want to call it. There's work that can be done above your critical power. Okay? And if we calculate for each one of these things, the area, the amount of time, right? The area, the time multiplied by this area under this above critical power. If you're a little bit over this long rectangle that looks like this, if you're way over this long rectangle that looks this way, where there's a lot of power but a little bit of time, all of these four rectangles have the same area to them. So what this tells us is that there's this common amount of work that we can do. Okay? Imagine it's like a bucket that's full of water. You can ride the bike, and when you're above critical power, you start dumping the water out of the bucket. And when the bucket is empty, you stop. You can't go any farther. Okay? So if you're just a little bit above your critical power, you're dumping it out really slowly. If you're way above, you're dumping it out really fast. Either way, you just have that amount of water in your bucket. Okay? And when it's empty, you have to stop exercising. But that's this idea of what's called W prime. Okay? What determines W prime? We don't know. It's probably related to anaerobic energy stores, how much creatine phosphate you have, how much myoglobin you have, to some other things. But then we can do some weird, crazy things to W prime by making muscles ischemic and some other kind of wild things that can go on. It's not solely stored anaerobic energy, but there is some of that that's probably going to contribute. Okay. So you guys have probably heard of, if you've taken any kind of undergraduate exercise phys classes, that we want to prescribe exercise to people that it's going to be light intensity activity, moderate intensity activity, and vigorous intensity activity. You guys heard those words before? And that light is basically like walking slowly to walking really slowly. It's like 3 metabolic equivalents. And then 3 to 6 is considered moderate, which is up to kind of like a slow jog, and then 6 and above is vigorous, which is jogging. The way we should do these things realistically is we need to separate and assume that VO2 max is up here, critical power is here, lactate threshold is here, and the resting rate is down here. So that any exercise that is below lactate threshold, we call moderate. Okay, we call that moderate. There's this zone between lactate threshold and critical power where you're making lactate. Blood lactate rises, but it will still reach some steady state somewhere above 2, and it may reach 4 or 5 or 6 even, and then plateau off. This is called heavy intensity activity. Okay. And then everything above critical power or critical velocity is called severe intensity activity. If you do severe intensity activity, you're going to have to stop in a predictable manner. If you're doing moderate, right, you can go for a very long time and basically making a lactate. And if you do heavy intensity, you're going to have lactate above resting levels, but it should still reach a steady state. You can do this for quite a long time. Okay? This is probably the best way to kind of look at all of these different things. Okay? So rather than just simply normalizing exercise prescription to a person's VO2 max, we should probably normalize it to sort of this range between where is their lactate threshold and where is their critical power as well. And there's some ways to go about that. We don't really talk about it here, but I'd be happy to discuss with you guys. Talk about. Yes, ma'am.
So when training for endurance, the recommendation in regards to critical work would be train above critical work for as long as possible, or train at critical work.
It depends upon what you want the adaptation to be.
Okay.
There are going to be situations where when you do high intensity interval training, right, you're going to be above critical power, critical velocity, whatever modality. You're going to be above that critical threshold. And oftentimes you may be well above and you're basically going for 30 seconds as hard as you can, which I'll talk about in a minute on some of these kinds of things. And so you're above, you're making a bunch of lactate, and it's that true kind of maxing out of the metabolic things that drive a lot of these other adaptations. Then there may be some other instances where you want to be below because you want to kind of train that longer duration, which may not necessarily have all of the metabolic effects of the other things, but you're training bones and tendons and ligaments, and you're training sort of the psychological aspect of time. If you're between lactate threshold and critical power, I promise you, it's going to feel uncomfortable, right? It's not so uncomfortable that you have to physiologically slow down, but there's a level of discomfort that you've got to kind of make peace with, that I can continue, right? We don't talk very much in here about how people do pacing strategies and those things, but there's some level of stuff that goes around all of that. There's an idea of this kind of critical afferent, kind of critical uncomfortable pain kind of hypothesis that you can tolerate a certain amount. And when it gets to be too much sensory input from that, then you're going to slow down because you're just worried whether you can physiologically keep going, you're just going to stop because you're slow down. So there's you need to do some to figure out that you can do that or that you can do more, if that makes any sense. Okay. So there are no, as far as I know, there are no recommendations in any of the kind of NSCA, ACSM things as it relates to where you should be in relation to critical power. It's hard to measure these things. We got to have poor Drew come and do at least 4 or 5 bouts of really intense, all the way to you're going to have to stop exercise for us in order to get the most accurate version. Now, there's a way to do it in one shot. It's basically a 3-minute long Wingate test. It's called what they do now is you get VO2 max and you get critical power out of one test. But we give you some very, very high work rate, and we just say you have to ride the bike as hard as you can for 3 minutes.
So would that cause the psychological effects as well? Like,
oh yeah.
okay.
I'll post a couple of videos of people doing it, and it's just what you think. It's like 20 seconds in, your creatine phosphate is gone. I mean, people, it's all they can do to keep the bike going, right? But you do that, and it starts off here, and you just watch it. It all goes by pedal rate, and your pedal rate just falls and falls and falls, and then eventually it levels off back here. And so as it levels off, and you're like, okay, that's what our critical power is.
Okay.
It's terrible. It looks so bad. They've done the same thing. One of my buddies who's at Kansas State, where they've done a lot of this kind of work, they did it running. They had a golf cart and they chased people around on a track and would like yell at them. And you have to run for 3 minutes, basically sprint as fast as you can go for 3 minutes. And by like a minute in, they're just barely going, right? But it's all they've got. And you have to keep, and then they had a little thing where they were following, they knew how fast they were going. And that's how they would get their critical velocity, rather than doing like 4 bouts on the treadmill at different speeds to see how long you can go do it. You can do this one shot deal. I've not done any of the one shot things. I think I might prefer the 4, right? In some ways. So anyway, so this is showing the VO2 response, the work rate response, and the blood lactate response to sort of the 4. This is 4 bouts of exercise. You've got one that's below lactate threshold and below critical power, one that's just below critical power, and then 2 that are just above. So you will note, right, like an exercise below lactate threshold, there's really no lactate increase. Between lactate threshold and critical power, it goes up. So you can see an increase above rest, but it will level off. And then in our other 2, it's just going to increase and stop at a roughly the same place because you're going to reach max, which is what this one is showing. Okay. If you're below lactate, you get a steady state. You're between lactate and critical power, it goes up, and you probably will be able to reach a steady state, but it's going to be a little bit of creep and a little bit of slow component and then level off. And then the other 2 that are above, you're going to basically reach VO2 max by the time you get to the end. Okay. So this describes the way that these things are going to are going to end up looking. Okay. I think this is pretty fun. Here is a graph. These are some data from DeCostal and Vince Saltine from the 70s. Here is lactic acid, okay, expressed relative to sort of a peak level during a max test. And then here's the resting level. And they got it at the end of different competitive running distances. Okay. And you've got, they're running 40, almost 45 kilometers. What's that like? 20 miles or something, right? 20 miles, like 15 miles, and all the way down. Hey, look at all of this. Here's rest. Here's these kinds of things. Before I talked about this being critical power, boy, this lactate response looks hyperbolic, just like the critical power response. Okay, so these things have been observed in one way, shape, or form for very, very long times. It just took a few people to kind of put all of these things together. So some of the early studies on all of this, after they identified it, was trying to understand the relationship between lactate threshold and critical power or critical velocity, because there was a group of thought that maybe they were the same thing, right? That there's this one critical inflection point metabolic, and that's going to be the same thing. And so these are some data from a guy who's a professor at Kansas State. His name is David Poole. These are data from David's doctoral dissertation when he was in Carl Wasserman's lab. Not that that means anything to you guys, but it should. In Carl Wasserman's lab at UCLA. And so this is the power output and the VO2 and the percentage of VO2 max where lactate threshold occurs. Okay. This is what they're calling, this is basically their, this is their sort of critical power in this way. And this is, I think, the max power. It's going to be down over there. And so what you guys can see, this is pre-training and post-training, is that lactate threshold is occurring at about 45%, right, of VO2. Then this critical power component is occurring at about 80%, okay? But then they trained them, and lactate threshold went up, the critical power didn't go up compared to their VO2 max being able to go up at their max work rates also went up. So they're seeing that they're beginning to, there are these two different things that are happening. And when you do training, they may both change independent of each other, okay? Everybody's critical power occurs at a different percentage of your max work rate. And you can, even though it didn't happen in this study, you can train, okay? Here, lactate threshold went up in an absolute and a relative sense compared to max. The critical power still occurred at the same relative percentage of their max. Your max just went up, but it's still at about 80%. There's some evidence in people that these things can change. Okay. Your next question, probably from Christina, is how do I train my critical power? You have to train over. Here's some really fun data. They've done a bunch of work with all of this, and I'll show you guys several things. This is stuff that was in one of the articles that I gave you guys. So here's the VO2 response, and they've got a person riding a bike. They found their critical power. Here they're riding 5 watts below their critical power. Here they're riding 5 watts above their critical power. 5 watts below, boom, Brady's riding forever. Okay? We put him 5 watts. 200 watts to 205, 5 watts, that's all it is. And VO2 never reaches steady state, and he ends up going to max, okay? Tiny fractions of an increase in force production are enough to tip the physiology to where you're gonna have to go to peak, okay? Now you can look at all of this, and you may think, well, if I'm only 5 watts above, I can still kind of keep going. So I'm gonna wait until the end of my race, and then I'm going to blow all my W prime at the end as I kick at the end, right? There's some stuff now, like I can blow it at the front, then I can duck under critical power, and the W prime will come back, and then I can kick again at the end. So we're kind of looking on kind of how we manage and how we train. So really, really fascinating kinds of things. This is from the same study, where they're 5 watts above and 5 watts below. Here's lactate, 5 watts below. Lactate, 5 watts. Okay. This is the ratio of lactate to pyruvate and these kinds of things that are going on over time. When you're below, it's going to be constant. When you're above, you're getting more and more lactate out of your pyruvate. And here's the change in intramuscular pH. In these people, pH falls, you become a little bit acidic, and then it levels off. And then when you're above critical power, it just continues. And we think that this accumulation of hydrogen ions, I'll show you guys some magnet data where you accumulate inorganic phosphate, likely from the breakdown of creatine phosphate in those things. When you are just tiny bits above, you tip the pH and the inorganic phosphate stuff out of balance. They increase or decrease appropriately. And there's some critical pH level and critical inorganic phosphate level that causes task failure. So this is just fascinating things. Can you imagine that, right? Like you're running and you're going, you know, a foot faster every, a foot farther with every stride, or a foot faster every minute on something, and that might be enough to make you fatigue. It's that fine of a measurement on these things. Okay. So these are data from in the magnet. So this is magnetic resonance spectroscopy. These were done by one of David Poole's students. His name is Ian Jones. Anybody has watched, if you haven't, you need to. It's great. It's on Disney Plus if you have Disney Plus. If not, I'm sure you guys can torrent or whatever and find it. There's a National Geographic Channel special. It's called Breakings 2. It's about Nike's attempt to get the guys to break the 2-hour marathon. And the head physiologist that is working with identifying and training the guys is this fellow. He's at the University of Exeter. There's some done a lot of really cool stuff. But this is showing the VO2 response, the blood lactate response that we've seen. Here is PCR, intramuscular creatine phosphate levels, intramuscular pH levels. And so just know when I'm 5% above critical or below critical power, PCR falls a little bit and it's steady state. So I'm able to meet that work rate primarily aerobically. When I'm only 5% above, I can't meet it aerobically, and so I get this depletion. Same thing happens with pH, right? So pH is going to fall. It looks a lot like all of these kinds of things. So we know that when I get over critical power, I cannot meet that energy demand aerobically. So I have to use up creatine phosphate. I start making more and more lactate, and the combination of those things leads to task failure. Okay. So these are the same data, but they are from a different version of the test. Okay. I'm going to put some YouTube videos up for you guys that probably that are by this fellow. His name is Mark Burnley. He does a much better job probably of explaining all of this than I will. He has a YouTube channel, and you guys should follow him. He does a lot of podcasts too on these things. His YouTube channel is called All Out Physiology. But these are the same data from the magnet. The Burnley's test is, it's not running, it's not cycling, it is isometric contractions. And you just do maximal isometric contractions. Okay. So we get side to stand up and push against the wall as hard as it can for 3 seconds and then stop. And then push against the wall as hard as you can for 3 seconds and stop. And you do this over time, and what you see is that your maximal force will fall, but you get to a place, this is for 5 minutes, but you get to a place out here where it mostly levels off. And so this is called critical torque. And we measure critical torque, we measure critical power in the same people, and what you find is that critical power and the velocity, we think, are determined by some intramuscular force production, which is what all the images do. But they see the same thing. Right, you're above, PCR falls, and it doesn't do these things. Inorganic phosphate goes up, pH falls, and so you can do this particular kind of test in multiple ways. It seems to be conserved across different kinds of contractions and different exercises. Okay. So here's this isometric test. This is the original paper from Burnley where they did all of this. Here. These is quadriceps, kick as hard as you can for 3 seconds and then relax. Keep doing that for 5 minutes. You get 60 contractions. This is their peak torque and then the mean torque under the 3 seconds. But this is part of the torque test. Here is a another version of this done by our own Dr. Kellaway. Before I even knew who Dr. Kellaway was, we were looking at this paper like, oh, wait, that guy applied for our job. This is done in hand grip. So squeeze the hand grip thing as hard as you can. They went 10 minutes, but you see roughly the same thing, that it falls, right? And then it levels off out here. So we know there is some critical amount of force production that can be supported by aerobic metabolism, right? And that critical amount of force production can then be applied to either run or bike in some way and give us a power output. I didn't forget that I put this in here. We'll toot our own horn ever so mildly. This is one of my former master's students. We took all of this and did it with electrical stimulation. So we removed the person out and we manipulated their starting force production. And we did a couple of different sort of frequencies of action potentials coming in. And what you can see is that no matter where they start, they all fatigue down to roughly the same force production. If you put them below that force production, then they didn't fatigue at all. So what we in some ways demonstrated is that most of this is a peripheral phenomenon. That is a thing that is only occurring in the muscle. It's a metabolic issue with the muscle machinery. Okay. So we're doing some more stuff with all of this. If you guys ever want to see these things, it's kind of fun to have it done. Richard's had it done. Chris has had it done. Lisa and I have done this too many times. The rest of you will get your turn. It's like that. Okay.
Fine.
It's not that bad. It's way better than to do it while you just sit there and your leg gets contracted. You don't have to do anything. None out of breath. Doing the other ones
You just get scared sometimes.
I know. So people have tried, and there's been a lot of work from Andy Jones and some of his students. And this woman, her name is Annie Van Hatalo. She's also at the University of Exeter. They tried to elucidate how much of critical power is aerobic metabolism, how much of it is sensitive to creatine phosphate, can we manipulate it by altering anaerobic and aerobic metabolism and these kinds of things. And so one of the things that we know is that critical power is sensitive to oxygen, okay? And so what they did here was they supplemented people with hyperoxic gas. So we give you gas where you breathe it that has more oxygen in it than usual. And you wouldn't think normally that that would matter, right? Because we're at sea level and those kinds of things. But you give hyperoxic gas, that's this upper one, and we make the critical power go up. These are some data from Tom Barstow's lab, also at Kansas State from Ryan Brocksterman, who's done a bunch of work on all of this. They did, this is hand grip, but they put a blood pressure cuff on and included people. So you get no oxygen in there. And basically, here's their control condition. We include them and their critical power basically goes below zero, right? Which this is a weird mathematical phenomenon because of how they were doing things, but it's basically nothing. It falls dramatically if we limit oxygen. And so there's kind of multiple approaches to manipulating this, right? You go to altitude, it goes down, right? And those things. And so we know that it's somewhat dependent upon oxygen. So if I give you more red blood cells, guess what happens? Critical power. Okay? There will be some ways that are going to look at all of this. As I said, these people they've gone to altitude, and I'm trying to remember if this was actually I think it was. They did some stuff in, this is the critical power curves in the lab, and then they actually took them and they went up to altitudes. But what you can see basically is when you go to altitude, I think they went to like Pikes Peak or someplace and exercise up there. Anybody wants to, all of us get in a van and go to Colorado Springs for a couple of days and then just kill it on the bike for a little bit and then come home. Sounds like a fun road trip to me. You could also do this by having people breathe hypoxic gas. If I could just do a little bit of change the gas you're breathing and create that same scenario, but it goes down. Okay. So again, if we manipulate oxygen saturation, it alters critical power or velocity, telling us that this parameter has to be something to do with aerobic function. Matt.
So with the curves changing, having the maximum power output would be higher in the person for oxygen.
Generally. So the curve will change within you. So if I limit your oxygen, your maximal power output will go down. Okay? That's not to say necessarily that a different person who has different cardiovascular function and mitochondrial function and things, right? There's some other parameters. It works within a person, but it may not always exactly match between two people. I understand what I think you're asking. So again, when you go to altitude and your performance suffers, this is why. Why do things feel worse? If you ever try to go skiing, if you've ever had to be on spring break when you were still on the track team and you had to try to run on spring break at altitude in Santa Fe, you're like, why does this fucking suck? Well, it's because there's less air. Things like this are happening. And a pace that used to be over lactate threshold but under critical power is now so here they gave people, so that was the altitude. Here's the lab base of all of this. They gave people hypoxia. Okay. And they figured out that when you breathe normal air, their critical power is at about 220 watts. But when they gave them hypoxia, and I'm trying to remember how hypoxic they were. This is like 15% O2 or something that you breathe. It's not very much. But it goes down. It went down about 15%. Okay. And so their power output to go 3 minutes or 15 minutes also went down. So all of this is just different ways to try to demonstrate to you guys how people have attempted to understand the things that are contributed to all of this. Okay. We did this with our STEM test. We included people, and this is part of how we validated our STEM test was measuring critical power. We did inclusion and falls, we did those kinds of things. Duty cycle also matters. So this was based upon what we found, again, from another paper from K-State, where when you run, okay, when you do intermittent contractions, every time you contract, you occlude blood flow to the working muscles, okay? So if I tell you squeeze for 3 seconds and then let go for 2 seconds, and I say squeeze for 3 seconds and now let go for 4 seconds, okay? That's called the duty cycle. So if you have more rest time in between, there's more time to replenish oxygen. And so this, they flip the curve. This is time here and power here. But it's just showing that when you get more rest time, you get a higher power. And so this plays some role in sort of running economy or movement economy and how long people have to contract to cover those things versus when they get to rest and some of that. We tried it with the STEM again, and we saw the same kind of thing too. Okay, so here's where some weird things happen. What happens when I do occlusion if we think that W prime is wholly anaerobic energy? I do occlusion, it shouldn't matter, right? I'm just cutting off oxygen, it shouldn't change how much anaerobic energy we have. Well, when they did the occlusion in the Brockstrom paper, their W prime value actually went up. They have no explanation. Okay. If we look here in sort of the one where they did normoxia and some level of hypoxia, not for occlusion, they were calling it, this is their W prime measure. I'm forgetting that what a accumulated work something above, this is that. They didn't find a difference. But in this one, they did. Okay. And so there have been some future studies that have gone on since all of this, but we've begun to get a little bit of a picture in the last 5 years or so. The W prime is not just simply how much creatine phosphate do you have, what kind of capacity do you have to make and handle hydrogen ions and those kinds of things. There must be some other weird thing that's going on that is contributing to some of that. Okay? That might make it go up a little bit. Because in theory, if we can give you something, make your W prime go up, you can tick off, or you could run it a little bit above your critical power, critical velocity for a little bit. All right, I'm now trying to look at what this thing was And what I was trying to show you guys from all of this. Don't worry about this slide. This is just twitch force and some other kinds of things. Okay. So here's some interesting stuff. So these are data, again, these are from one of Burnley's papers where they're doing the critical torque test. But this is showing stem force, and then this is showing what we call voluntary activation. So we talked way back in the early part of the semester about twitch interpolation. This is our ability to measure, okay, central drive coming from the nervous system, how much of that is getting out to lead to motor unit improvement. This potentiated doublet torque, this is from E-stem. This is a measure of peripheral fatigue. This is a measure of central fatigue. And so one of the things that we know with the things that interact to determine both critical power and critical time is there's some level of peripheral fatigue as well as some level of central fatigue that are both happening that can determine where our sort of critical metabolic threshold is going to be. And there's going to be an interaction between these two. If we can better understand that, can we alter your perceptual side potentially and get a little bit less central fatigue? And then we'll do something out here in the muscle potentially. So both of these things are happening. So kind of mind and physiology are in there. Fiber type matters, right? If we think the critical power is going to be important for performance, fiber type percentage also seems to matter. So here's critical power in a person's percentage of type 1 fibers and their percentage of type 2 fibers. We also have capillary density in type 1 fibers and capillary density in type 2 fibers. And what you will see is that in general, people that have more type 1 fibers tend to have a higher critical power. People that have a higher percentage of type 2 fibers tend to have a lower thing. So again, more capillary seems to be positively correlated regardless on all of this. So again, more evidence that some of this is aerobic metabolic function, both from a muscle kind of machinery standpoint, a mitochondrial standpoint, capillary, and O2 delivery, extraction. So all of these things are working together to help us. This lends further credence to endurance runners seem to benefit from having more type 1 fibers and fewer type 2. So fascinating things here. Let me make sure what this one is. This one's going to be. So this is caffeine and critical power. And so what we see on all of this was they gave people caffeine and then they had them do the bike test. Right? Caffeine may manipulate sensations of pain. It may also manipulate peripheral function a little bit. And they found that it didn't alter critical power, but it allowed people to have a little, this is their WEP. This is their W prime measure. It allowed people to do a little bit more work above critical power, which I think is pretty cool. This has not been repeated by anybody else that I am aware of. If anybody wants to do a thesis project they want to do, we could certainly do something like all of this. We know that caffeine seems to dramatically improve exercise performance in endurance. Don't worry about this. We did a muscle damage thing. Let me get to what this thing is. Okay. So this is kind of the big take. Okay. I want to show you guys. So these are some data in men and in women. Okay. And what they did was, this is critical velocity or critical walking speed for running. Okay. And what they found was that they had them do these very practical tasks. You had to do a 10-kilometer walk back time. So you had to cover 10 kilometers. And they had these folks like loaded down with a backpack with stuff in it, asking them to do some stuff. This was funded by a thing from NASA. I'll show you guys a little bit more of these data in a minute. And what they found, this is critical running velocity. This is their VO2 max. This is the speed at which they could reach their VO2 max. And then this is their gas exchange, their lactate threshold as a percentage of their VO2 max. And what they found was that the thing that best predicted performance on this walking task was their critical speed. Okay. If you are told you have to cover this 10 kilometers as fast as you possibly can, the thing that best predicted this for most people was their critical speed. It was a better predictor than their VO2 max, a better predictor than their lactate threshold, and a slightly better predictor than their running speed at their VO2 max. So this is really cool too, because this shows the actual application. Why should you care about this? This is the parameter. Okay. This is the parameter that can best predict people's performance in races compared to some of our other physiological measures. Okay. So that was this walk back time. Here, though, they did the same kind of thing, that they did a physical abilities field test. Now, in this particular field test, what these folks did was you do a series like an obstacle course. Okay. It's not exactly like Ninja Warrior, but it's kind of the same thing. You got a backpack and you got to walk over here, and you got to pick stuff up and you got to carry it over here, and you got to run over there and do all of these kinds of things. It was meant to simulate if you were on Mars. What would you have to be able to do on Mars in your spacesuit to perform a given amount of like your normal working tasks in those things? So let's carry this and move this over here, climb up these stairs, get over into this other kind of a thing. Okay. And again, they found on this performance battery that critical speed was the best predictor of performance above VO2 max, above lactate threshold, okay, above all of these other kinds of things. This is the thing that's the best predictor of these functional tasks. So my friend that did some of these things, this was funded by NASA. He would say that NASA would tell you they could send somebody to Mars right now. We could go to Mars, right? They've got a spacesuit, they've got the rocket, they've got the things. We can go to Mars. The problem is you'll be so untrained by the time you get there because of the years of space flight that, given the technology of the spacesuits, you basically have to start off as like a person with a VO2 max of like 80 mLs per kg per minute, and hold most of that over several years of space flight to just simply be able to walk around and do basic tasks on Mars, given the spacesuit technology. You might have seen the movie The Martian. One of my absolute favorite movies. I've got science the shit out of this thing. My favorite movie says. But all that stuff, like we don't have that spacesuit technology. Like, you can't move that freely. Okay. And so your movements are really small. The suit is heavy. The gravity is weird. All of this stuff is going on. And it's just a real fucking problem. And so NASA's very interested in what are the things that will predict what we can do, and then how much fitness do we have to actually do it when we get there. Right? And then you got to figure out, well, how do you train and keep somebody at a cross-country runner level of fitness? How do you keep these 55-year-old, generally white guys at 20-year-old cross-country runner levels of fitness all the way to Mars? Well, I mean, that's what it's going to have to be.
Yeah.
Right. It's going to have to be the Iron Man suit or something. Yeah. In those ways. Or you're going to have to recruit Olympic cross-country runners. Right. We need, or I mean, they don't have to be those guys, but you need the Army Rangers, basically, right?
Yeah.
If anybody sees those guys, they tend to be super duper fit. They don't look like SWAT guys all the time. They're these really small, they look like cross-country runners in those ways because of the stuff they've got to carry and how far they have to go in the demands of their task. They don't look like MMA guys or anything. So I think this stuff is really, this part of this is really kind of cool. Okay. So we'll do this and then we'll probably stop and I'll try to answer some questions, then we can finish the rest of this off on Wednesday. So this is a schematic, and this is taken from as I said in the article from Mike Joyner and Ed Coyle, who's at Texas, Joyner's at Mayo. And they were going to talk about this idea of performance velocity or performance power. This is from 2006 or 2008 before all those other data came out. But it's this, there is some work capacity that I have, and it's determined by anaerobic parameters, aerobic parameters, and then what's called gross mechanical efficiency, which if you've ever looked at sort of like robots, or this is, sort of like, this is your car's gas mileage, and then your gas tank and your engine and all of these things. And so that we know they were talking about, look, performance VO2, which is basically critical power in a lot of ways, is determined by lactate threshold and max VO2, which are determined by capillaries and stroke volume and heart rate and hemoglobin content and mitochondrial content and how you're able to arrive at this power distribution. And then mechanical efficiency is, right, slow twitch fibers. And it's your anthropometrics and elasticity. What are your leg lengths and your arm lengths and your segment lengths look like in the midst of all of this? And it's all of these things working together. They're going to play some role in our ability to do these particular things. Because the weird thing, okay, for some of you guys, and I have some data that I will show you guys on Wednesday, is you can have a person that appears to be less fit on the surface, okay, who may actually be able to win a race or perform tasks better than someone that has a higher VO2 max, because essentially their critical power is at like 95% of their max. Okay. So we did some stuff in some cross-country runners in my very first job, and we found that the girl that was the best cross-country runner on our track team had the lowest VO2 max. But she could essentially run at her max for the race. Right? She had reached her fullest potential. There were some other girls that had higher VO2 maxes, but their lactate thresholds and things were at like 60% of their maxes. So they had some room to do better. And so we've got to consider then slow twitch fiber percentage, stroke volume, capillaries, all of this. Okay. So we'll pick up here. And we'll talk about VO2 a little bit more, some of the limiting factors on VO2. We'll talk about movement economy and some other things that kind of tie some of this stuff back hopefully together. Okay. I know you guys have a stats test. Many of you are sort of mentally here, but mentally not.